So good morning. My name is Amber Vorhies, and I am with JLM Environmental. We are a inspection and laboratory. We test all of the fun hazardous things like mold, asbestos, lead, radon. We handle a variety of inspections. And I have my amazing colleague Steve here today. He is our teacher. He's going to teach on asbestos awareness and how we can help you and your clients have a better understanding going into your escrow transactions and just house hunting and all that fun stuff. So I'm going to turn it over to Steve and let him get you guys going on your education this morning.
All right. Good morning, everybody. As Amber said, my name is Steve Vaughn. I'm the operation manager here at JLM Environmental. And today we'll be going over asbestos and how to manage those issues during your transaction. To start off, I just want to give you a little bit of background about myself. As I mentioned, I am the operations manager here at JLM Environmental. I've been with the company nearly a decade. But on top of being the the operations manager, I'm also an inspector. I'm a certified asbestos consultant, a CAC through Cal OSHA. I'm also a Cal OSHA certified asbestos instructor. We have our own training facility where we teach individuals in our industry how to become inspectors, how to do abatement next door. So I actually am one of the instructors, and I've developed the curriculum there. I'm a lead sampling technician with the CDPH, a radon measurement specialist with the National Radon Safety Board. And on the other side of the industry, I've also worked on the laboratory side. I was the first laboratory manager for our in-house lab, JLM Environmental Laboratory. Last year, we rebranded to become Pinnacle Laboratory, and I'm currently serving as the interim lab manager over there as well. During my time doing laboratory work, I've analyzed nearly 100,000 asbestos samples. So I'm pretty familiar with how to analyze asbestos samples, the ins and outs. So that's just a little bit about myself to give you a little bit of background. So to kind of jump into it, I want to talk about quickly what asbestos is. I think we all have an idea of what asbestos might be. We've seen those commercials online for the mesothelioma attorneys. We may have heard about it in passing during transactions, contractors, but I kind of want to just start with the basics before we get into more finer detail. So asbestos is just a generalized term for a set of minerals. I got a little technical here, and I call them the silicate groups. In the US, the EPA regulates 6 specific minerals as asbestos: chrysotile, chrysotolite, actinolite, tremolite, amosite, and thopholite. So 99% of the times when you come across asbestos in a home, it's going to be that first one, chrysotile. It's also referred to as white asbestos. The image on the right-hand side of the screen there is actually what raw chrysotile asbestos looks like in nature. It is very prevalent here in California and worldwide. In fact, California's state mineral is serpentinite, and serpentinite is it forms in a series of chrysotile. So if you find a serpentinite or serpentine rock here in California, there's a good chance that there might be asbestos mixed in with it. They've lobbied for years to change it because of that issue, but it seems like it's going to stick around. Obviously, the main issue with asbestos is it is considered a carcinogen. Prolonged exposure to asbestos fibers can result in asbestosis, mesothelioma, or lung cancers. And the main hazard with asbestos is really when those fibers become airborne. Now, with all these health issues related to asbestos, you might say, well, why did they start using asbestos, right? If it's so dangerous, why did they use it? Well, asbestos has several properties that make it ideal for use in various applications. It's resistant to heat, it's resistant to electric charges, and it's also resistant to acids and chemicals. Yeah. So with heat resistant property, it's used in flame retardant materials, fireproofing in buildings, firefighter equipment, and other installation types of materials, such as thermal system insulation. With the electrical current resistant, that's why it's useful for old insulation on home wiring and on power lines. The acid and chemical resistance, you typically see that more in industrial, commercial applications, such as laboratory equipment. That doesn't really come into play with residential properties. But the last characteristic of asbestos is actually why you see it a lot in building materials, and it has high tensile strength. It's used, and for that reason, it's used as a binder in building materials. When you grind up asbestos fibers and you mix it in with a building material, it helps bond everything much stronger. And that's why those materials tend to last a lot longer, especially things like transite or resilient floor tiles. So now that we know kind of what asbestos is, I want to dive into what to expect during an asbestos inspection. So say your client is concerned about asbestos, or you advise them to get an asbestos inspection. What does that look like? So with asbestos inspections, there's two types of inspections most companies can do. There's a limited inspection or there's a comprehensive inspection. With limited inspections, that's where we're hired to assess very specific materials or areas of the home. So for example, if your client has past experience with asbestos on their heating system and they only want us to look at the heating system, that would be considered a limited inspection because we are only looking at those components. For the real estate transactions, typically what we do is what's called a comprehensive inspection. And that's where the client wants the entire home assessed. So that way we check all the areas. If the attic and crawl spaces are accessible, an asbestos inspector will go in there to see if there's any pipe lagging, vent pipes, insulation materials, whatever that might be in those areas. And this is what, again, is what's typically recommended for real estate transactions. The reason for this is because you really want to know what's in the home before you drop a lot of money, right? This is one of the biggest purchases in a person's life. So you really want to know what might be present. The typical asbestos inspection runs about 45 minutes to about 2 hours. It really depends on the extent. Are we doing a limited or is it comprehensive? And then how many materials are present? If it's an older home, it has a lot of the original materials over the years. Say they've stacked 4 or 5 layers of linoleum in one room. Now, sometimes that can take a little bit of time to go through and make sure that we've thoroughly documented what might be suspect for asbestos. So when we're doing an asbestos inspection, the primary method of sampling is by sampling the building materials. That's usually why we're called out, is to see what building materials have asbestos in them. The way that materials are sampled is the inspector will use safe sampling methods. And what they do is they mist down any materials that they're going to be sampling with an amended water solution. And basically that's water with a little bit of dish soap in it, and it's in a little aerosolized bottle, like a little spritz bottle. Samples are typically taken from inconspicuous areas. We don't want to damage any of the aesthetics, especially during a real estate transaction. We want to be very careful to minimize any sort of visual impact. So we try to take them from areas that you can't see. So we're going to be sampling, say, a wall material, say there's concerns about the plaster. Typically, inspectors will take samples of the wall from behind a light switch cover or an outlet cover, or inside a closet, kind of inside the door. So when you're looking in the closet, you don't see it's kind of around the corner. So it's not visually impacting. And the samples are very small. As you can see in the photograph right there on the side, it's about the size of a penny per sample. Now, while the samples are only about a penny each, it's important to know that the AQMD, the South Coast Air Quality Management District, here in the greater Los Angeles, Orange County area, they do have requirements for how many samples are collected per material. And they say that for each building material that is sampled, we're required to collect a minimum of 3 samples. Now, if it's a larger home or if there's a lot more of that material, a greater square footage, they may require more, up to 7 is kind of where the maximum is. And that's based off the square footage. But for most materials, 3 samples is the bare minimum. And that's following SCAQMD Rule 1403. So if you ever have any questions about what an asbestos inspector tells you, A lot of that verbiage is going to be right there in Rule 1403. It's really easy to find. If you type that in, Google it, it kind of tells you everything that's required in the asbestos survey, as well as on the abatement side. Now, after we take those samples, we take them to a laboratory for analysis, and it's analyzed by polarized light microscopy, or PLM. As I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, I've analyzed many asbestos samples, and a bulk of those are those PLM samples. So we take those samples, they get ground up, they get burned in a furnace, they get treated with acid. And basically, the purpose is to release those asbestos fibers that may be embedded in those building materials. As I mentioned, it was used as a binder. So in order to determine if asbestos is present, we want to make sure we can break that material up and see what's under there under the microscope. Another type of sample that can be done is air sampling. So say the inspector sees a heating system that has suspect materials for asbestos, and there's questions as whether or not asbestos fibers are being blown into the home. What we can do is take air samples where we set up pumps. They run for anywhere from 30 minutes to about 3 hours, depending on the type of air sampling that's being requested. And then those get sent, either they can be analyzed on site by analysts if they're trained properly for PCM analysis, or they can be sent to a laboratory. If you request TEM air samples, which are more in depth, they use a much more expensive microscope. That has to be done by a laboratory. Those microscopes are typically the size of a large conference table. They can be analyzed for about 10,000 times magnification. So, but for most inspections, PCM, the one that can be done on site or just at a regular laboratory, will be sufficient for 90%, 99% of all applications, especially for real estate transactions. It's very rare to see TEM air samples collected during a real estate transaction. If there's concerns about asbestos fibers being released in the air and then settling on surfaces, we can also take dust samples. Dust samples can be collected several ways. The most common one is using a dust wipe, where it looks like basically I'll say a baby wipe, and it's wiped down onto a non-porous surface such as glass or metal or plastic to see if any asbestos fibers have settled in that dust. Or if there's a porous material, say carpet or upholstery, TEM microbag samples can be collected. The time for that can also be anywhere from 30 to 180 minutes. Not so much for the sampling time, but that's more for the assessment. And those are analyzed by either PLM, so dust wipes can be analyzed by PLM, or TEM. And again, with the microvac samples, those are TEM, and those have to go to an outside lab typically. So that's kind of the basics of what to expect during an asbestos inspection. Again, it takes anywhere from 45 minutes to 2 hours. The inspector will advise you on what materials are suspect for asbestos. So they'll walk through, they'll say, hey, I found this, this, and this. Would you like me to collect samples of that? And then you can accept or decline those while they're on site. And then those samples are either collected from the actual building materials, or they collect air samples or dust samples. So the next step I want to talk about is, why is it important to do this during a real estate transaction? And the first thing to keep in mind is general home inspectors are rarely certified by Cal OSHA to perform asbestos inspections. As I mentioned earlier, I am a certified asbestos consultant, and that is one of the licenses that are required by the state for anybody performing an asbestos inspection. So if you have a general home inspector who tells you that they can test for asbestos as well, it's very important to make sure you ask if they are a certified asbestos consultant or a certified site surveillance technician, CSST, working underneath the CAC. There's very few home inspectors out there that I'm aware of in California, myself being one of them, and my colleague Jonathan Massey as well. Besides that, very rare to find that. So it's very important to make sure that whoever's testing for asbestos is certified by Cal OSHA to perform asbestos inspections. In order to become an inspector, you have to take anywhere from 2 to 4 classes initially and have 4 years of experience to be a CAC. and pass a state mandated exam. So there's a lot of steps, a lot of experience, a lot of training that goes into it. And then every year we also have to take refresher courses for every class that we take. So it's very important that you go with somebody who's certified, so you make sure that they're following the proper sampling guidelines. They're not exposing you, the client, the sellers, and it doesn't cause an issue during the transaction. You may also have seen this during in a general home inspection report. They'll have statements like this. This situation, this inspector wrote, only a certified asbestos consultant can verify the presence of asbestos, and then they recommended contacting a qualified professional. So in this case, this general home inspector recognized that they aren't licensed to, or sorry, certified to perform that type of inspection, and that's where they would refer you or your client to a company like ours or another CAC. Right there, just what I talked on. Make sure they're a CAC or CSST working underneath the CAC if they're doing any sort of asbestos testing in the property. The other thing about that is if they are not certified as a CAC or CSST and they provide you with a report, if you go to have abatement performed, or if the AQD gets called out during a renovation project because dust is being generated and a neighbor complains, and they see that a CAC or CSST was not hired to do the testing, not only will the testing company be in violation of state regulations, but they have gone after homeowners as well. So it's very important that you and your clients are familiar with the regulations on who's allowed to do that type of testing. And again, this is a major purchase. Your clients should know what potentially hazardous materials are in their homes before closing. Instead of after the close. And the reason for this is because it's, say you buy a house, you don't have an asbestos inspection performed, and then after it closes, your client has concerns about, asbestos, or they hear from their friend like, hey, your house might have asbestos. You call a certified asbestos consultant, and they take a look at, they say, the heating system, and there's damaged insulation all over that system. There's debris everywhere. In the crawl space, there's broken transite vent pipes. In a bathroom underneath, the recently installed linoleum is a bunch of damaged asbestos vinyl tiles. This can definitely be a shock, especially a sticker shock for your client, that they didn't expect these costs for the abatement. If there's damaged asbestos, the AQMD requires a specialized cleanup plan called a Procedure 5 plan to be generated before anything can be done. So that's an additional cost. So it's very important that they know kind of going into the late stages of the transaction, what's actually there. And I kind of touched on the AQMD being called out. So the SA AQMD, who I touched on previously with Rule 1403, one of their requirements is prior to any renovation or demolition activities in a property, the building materials must be tested for asbestos by a CAC first. The reason for this is they want to make sure that, one, they're not exposing the homeowner to asbestos, but two, the neighbors, the trash men, whoever might be coming in contact with those disturbed building materials are not being exposed and creating an airborne contamination. Okay, so we've talked about kind of what inspection entails, why it's important. Here's some materials that are commonly found in a home that might be recommended for testing. Now, I want to make sure that you're aware this is not a comprehensive list. These are just some common materials, and the only way to know what materials may be suspect for asbestos in a building would be to have an inspector actually go out and say, hey, I walked through the property and this is what I saw. So touching back on these properties, heat resistant, electrical resistance, acid and chemical resistant, high tensile strength, as I mentioned. It's used in a lot of materials. So this is an image provided by WorkSafe British Columbia. The Canadians have a wonderful asbestos program up in British Columbia, and they put a lot of information. But this is great even for us here in California. So kind of starting on the roof levels, asbestos can be found in the roofing system, the roof felt, asphalt shingles. If there's mastic around vent pipes, that could be in that penetration mastic. Older style homes may have gutter systems that are made with asbestos cement. The brand name is called Transite. You may have heard that before. So some of those hard cementitious gutters may be asbestos containing. Deck undersheeting, stucco. Stucco is a very common one to find asbestos in. It's usually at lower levels, but it is very common to find, especially in older homes. Soffit boards, transite siding. Oftentimes, if you see old siding that's hard and cementitious, it comes back as transite, and those have asbestos fibers embedded in. In fact, you pop back just a few slides here. This sample right here is actually from transite siding. I'm not sure if you're able to see it on your screen, but there are some blue fibers and some white fibers. So this actually has two different types of asbestos. The blue fibers being chrysotile, and the white fibers being chrysotile. So transite is a very common material to find in older homes. It could be in vented pipes, siding, gutter systems. Now let's go into the inside. Acoustic texture, popcorn ceilings. That's a very common one. In fact, when we get called out to do asbestos testing, typically is, hey, I have popcorn ceilings. I want to get those tested. And then when we're on site, we always like to let our clients know, like, hey, there may be additional materials. Would you like us to take a look? Because they may not be aware that it could be in other materials. For plaster walls are very common for older homes. If they're newer, dry wall with joint compound, that joint compound can come back positive for asbestos. Vinyl floor tile, linoleum, the adhesive mastic used on vinyl floor tiles and linoleum. As I mentioned several times, the heating system, the insulation on the ducts, millboard panels underneath the furnace or on your rafters up in the attic, attic insulation. As you can see, there's many, many different types of materials that could have asbestos that you or your client may not be aware of. That's why it's important to have a asbestos inspection done, because if they plan on doing any sort of renovation or they have any health concerns, maybe they have a small child and they're very worried about environmental hazards, there may be materials that are overlooked because they aren't the most common ones, like heating system or acoustic texture. And according to the AQMD, all materials with the exception of metal, wood, and glass are considered suspect for material and need to be sampled accordingly before any type of work can begin. So it's very important to keep that in mind and to inform your clients of that. Here's a couple of pictures of what I was talking about. So a damaged heating system. In this case, the plenum, as you can see, that insulation material is all torn up. That's thermal system insulation. You might hear it referred to as air cell sometimes, or corrugated asbestos insulation. That right there can contain anywhere from 35 to 60% asbestos of that material. So when you take a piece of it and you break it up, 35 to 60% of that material is just raw asbestos fibers. Usually it's mixed in with paper. That's the other constituent. Here, sorry for the graininess of it, but here's 9-inch floor tile. 9-inch floor tile, I would say, for the most part, it does come back positive for asbestos. There are a few types that don't, but if you see 9-inch floor tiles, that should be an immediate red flag that, hey, this might contain asbestos. On the right-hand side, you see some black adhesive mastic underneath that tile. Black adhesive mastic is also frequently comes back for asbestos. Not always, but it is more often than not comes back positive for asbestos. And in this case, you can see there's damage to the tile, there's debris pieces. So if the homeowner was to get this abated, first they would need to have one of those Procedure 5 cleanup plans generated, because that is a AQB requirement. Prior to abatement, the abatement contractor must submit a P5 plan before they can get started. The P5 plans are written by CACs. This was actually a unique property. This is a job that I did. Up there on the roof there, up on the parapet, that black mastic that's on the wall, parapet walls, as well as on the wood there, that was all asbestos containing. What had happened is there was a rolled roofing system that was rolled across the roof and then up on those walls. And when the contractor pulled it off, they found a lot more of that roof tar, that mastic underneath. So that was a pretty gnarly abatement process. So again, it's important to have somebody check that out, because from my understanding, the homeowner did not have an asbestos inspection performed prior to closing. They just saw that there was rolled asphalt, and they just didn't think anything of it, but when they had to go repair the roof, this is where the issue came. And I just kind of want to wrap up this presentation with some common questions that we get that maybe you have or have had in the past. So question number one, my house was built after 1980. Why do I need to have an asbestos inspection? I thought that was banned. I thought they don't use it anymore. And the answer again always goes back to AQB here in LA, Orange County, Riverside County, and San Bernardino. They require structures of all ages to be inspected for asbestos prior to renovation or demolition, as the importing of asbestos has not been fully banned. Now, recently, within the last month or so, the Biden administration has been pushing forward some legislation with the EPA to finally ban the final stages of manufacturing asbestos here in America and to tighten some of the importing rules. But because it hasn't been fully banned, there is always a chance that a contractor may have used asbestos in certain applications, especially roofing. We've done inspections of homes that were built in 2023, and unfortunately, we did find asbestos. It was, again, roofing material, but the contractor, for whatever reason, used asbestos-containing materials on the roof. Question number two, can you tell if something has asbestos just by looking at it instead of taking samples? That's a very common one. Hey, I really don't want you to take samples. Can you just tell me if it has asbestos? Unfortunately, as I mentioned previously, the only way to legally say if something has asbestos or not is by analyzing it by PLM. Now, there are some materials, again, like transite or that thermal system insulation that is almost always comes back positive for asbestos. And as consultants, we can assume something to be positive, but the regulations do not allow us to assume something is negative. So we can say like, yeah, it's very likely that has asbestos, or hey, because it is transite, we can assume it positive. We don't have to take a sample of that transite, but we can't say, no, I don't think it has asbestos unless there is actually testing done. Is there a risk of exposure from collecting samples? And as long as you're using a certified asbestos inspector, they should be following safe sampling methods. As I mentioned before, they spritz it down with a minted water solution. They're going to be taking very small pieces, and that's done to really prevent any release of airborne fibers. Now, you may see an inspector wearing a respirator, a HEPA filter equipped respirator. The reason for that is, we're putting our face right up there. So there is always a chance. If anything, we're going to be the ones that are at risk of exposure. But again, it's more often than not, there won't be any fibers, but that's just done as precaution, as well as that is something that Cal OSHA requires workers to do, is to keep that respiratory protection on hand for that kind of situation. Question, how many samples do we collect? This is a huge one. Hey, I'm going to have you do an asbestos inspection. Well, how many samples are you going to take? Unfortunately, since every building, every home is different, we can't give you an exact answer until we do an assessment and we can see what materials are present then, right? So we'll do our walkthrough. We'll go area by area, especially if it's comprehensive, make a list of all the materials that we observed that are suspect for asbestos and let you know, hey, finish my walkthrough. I saw this, and this. Would you like me to collect samples of that? So that can also dictate how many samples your client or you acting on behalf of your client authorizes. Also, and I had it on the slide before, but I'm not sure if I verbalized it. The sellers may not provide authorization to collect samples. We have that from time to time. So if you're on the buying side, it's important to coordinate with the selling agent to make sure that you have authorization to collect samples. Again, they're very small, they're taken in inconspicuous areas, but sometimes they just don't want any sort of damage done, even the smallest amount, until after close. So that's important to keep in mind. So that can also determine the number of samples. They may let us sample the exterior. They may not let us sample, floor tile or whatever that might be. And then when will I get my results? So it can vary from company to company, but typically results and reports are ready within 1 to 2 business days. There are some companies that might take a week or more. It depends on, if they have an in-house laboratory or if they're shipping samples to a lab out of state. But typically, most companies, 1 to 2 business days, you'll have your lab results and your report in hand so you can determine where you want to go with for the next step. And then, can you remove the asbestos? You found the asbestos, can you help us remove it? In California, it is considered a conflict of interest and against state regulations to perform both testing and abatement. or the removal. So Cal OSHA says you can do one or the other. So typically what will happen is if there is asbestos there, your consultant may give you a recommended list of companies like, hey, these are some reputable companies we feel comfortable referring, but they themselves, the consultant, cannot do the actual abatement. So that's the end of my presentation. This is my contact information up on the screen. That's my email. You can call or text our office here at the number on the screen. We also have a nice little flow code, QR code right there at the bottom right corner. If you want to use your phone and scan that, that'll take you to our link tree that has our website, our social medias, different ways to contact us. So if you have any needs, any questions, feel free to reach out to us. You know, we're more than willing to help. Understand that asbestos is a very niche industry that not everybody's super familiar with. So we are more than happy to help you kind of walk through the steps and answer any questions you might have.
All right, thank you, Steve. So do we have any questions for Steve right now? Thanks for the presentation. So Yoko, Joanne,
Oh, sorry.
go ahead.
Why can't they use something that's safe? Like, why can't they use products that are safe that won't cause all these issues?
Joanne, you're making me laugh too early. Yeah, that's the $1 million question, right? So they began banning asbestos in certain materials starting in the late 70s. But because of, you know, lobbyists and all the political nonsense, it's just been really hard to get asbestos products fully banned. You know, I can tell you right now, a lot of the asbestos regulations haven't changed since the early 90s. There are some things that are trying to be pushed through right now, like the one I mentioned earlier. But yeah, it's just super difficult. There's a lot of deep pockets, I would say, that have interest in keeping some of those products available. But it seems like the tide is kind of turning against using those materials finally, at least here in the U.S.
Well, thanks, Steve. That was a great presentation. You know your stuff.
Thanks, Joanne.
All right, welcome, Jane. So, no, we are actually towards the end of the presentation here, but did you have any questions for Steve as to why you joined us today, and well, what questions do you have?
I wanted to take a moment. Sorry about the volume interference. Steve, we're in the same office. I wanted to take a minute and sort of step back. My previous life was a active real estate agent, and as Joanne mentioned, one of the biggest questions I got from my clients was that, you know, my home's newer, it's brand new, you know, I shouldn't have a need for this. So just kind of reiterating on what Steve was talking about, it definitely can be still very present in many areas of the home. So it's always safe, you know, better safe than sorry. And to be able to remove that risk from your buyers and buying a home that could potentially have, you know, issues moving on in the future with remodeling and whatnot. So thank you guys for being here. I don't know if there's any other questions or not. Okay, well, I look forward to seeing you all in the field when I'm out networking. You often see me out with the amazing Joanne. So please be sure to say hello and introduce yourself if you see me, and happy to continue to meet you all.